My name is Roberta Brandy Scratz. I am the founder of the effort to restore this landmark and a founder and current president of the Center for the Living City. Welcome to the Eldridge Street Synagogue. For many of you, this is your first visit. I hope it will not be your last. This has been the largest independent historic restoration in this city, not connected to a larger institution or public body. Started in the mid-1980s, the rebirth of this historic house of worship evolved slowly and steadily in the same way that Jane Jacobs taught us long ago how neighborhoods and whole cities rejuvenate over time through the efforts of many individuals. 20 years, 20,000 supporters, $20 million is approximately what it took to restore this landmark that was on the verge of loss. Jane actually followed the progress of this project through the reports that I would bring her on my visits to Toronto over many years. And she loved that the preservation effort, now formally a museum, embraced its Chinatown neighbors. And if you have ever been to one of our egg rolls, egg cream, and empanada days, you know why it is the most original, fun, and fascinating block party. Author and activist extraordinaire, Jane Jacobs' 7 books, starting with Death and Life of Great American Cities, changed the way the world views cities and helped us understand how the city is a fabric with all its parts: streets, parks, sidewalks, buildings, intricately connected and interdependent. To celebrate the centennial of Jacobs' birth this year, the Center for the Living City organized a year-long series of lectures to revisit, explore, and honor her ideas. Tonight is the 4th of the series of lectures by notable writers, thinkers, and activists to honor and build on the legacy of Jane Jacobs and to renew a discussion about her ideas. 2 years before her death, the Center for the Living City was established with her enthusiastic encouragement by a small group of urbanists expressly to build on her legacy. We are a national, even international organization with board members from New York, Toronto, Boston, Charlotte, Salt Lake City, Chennai, India, and Curitiba, Brazil. In the 10 years since our founding, we have sent a young architect as a Jane Jacobs Fellow to New Orleans to help low-income homeowners figure out how to rebuild their homes after Katrina. Created a post-Katrina exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York. Helped local people all over the world lead Jane Jacobs walks to observe their own communities. Published 3 books related to Jane's work, and have now established this lecture series. We have new, innovative programs brewing. This series is what our executive director, Stephen Goldsmith, calls a trigger. This is not just a celebration of Jane's ideas. This is an invitation to all of you to use these reflections to create responses to new problems. Jane taught us how to observe, understand, and value the urban life around us. Now we have the responsibility to put her teaching and our own observations to good use. And here we are in this glorious 1887 landmark, talking about Jane Jacobs, who famously said, "Old ideas can sometimes use new buildings. New ideas must use old buildings." And that brings us to tonight's speaker, Pulitzer Prize winner Paul Goldberger. We know Paul best first as architecture critic for the New York Times in the 80s and 90s, and then a Skyline columnist at the New Yorker, and today as contributing editor to Vanity Fair. But Paul has also written an unbelievable number of books, won more prizes than one would think possible, lectured all over the world, and taught at several places, including his alma mater, Yale, and now he is the Joseph Urban Professor of Design and Architecture at the New School. I am happy to add that Paul wrote about this Herculean effort to restore the synagogue very early in the process, and periodically checked in to write an update. He is among those who knows how long and arduous any historic preservation effort is. But this reflects a special quality that has been consistently true of Paul's architectural criticism. He is a deeply committed preservationist and has long honored the importance of preservation in the architectural, cultural, and economic health of this and every city. This past weekend, I was at the Toronto Film Festival for the premiere of Citizen Jane, a terrific documentary about Jane Jacobs, filled with great footage of Jane, some of which has never been seen. Happily, Paul is a prominent and articulate voice throughout the film. And by the way, Citizen Jane will premiere in New York November 10th at the SVA Theater on West 23rd Street. This is the opening feature of the Doc NYC Film Festival. Go online for tickets, don't miss it, it will sell out quickly. I have no doubt it will stimulate a much needed, renewed conversation about all that Jane stood for. Following Paul's remarks, we will take questions, and I will join Paul for a conversation. Paul?
Thank you very much, Roberta. It is wonderful it would be wonderful to be part of this lecture series under any circumstances. It is especially wonderful in this extraordinary place. What I didn't tell you back in 1977, I think it was, when I first came here, was that I thought the effort to restore this was absolutely impossible. It was too big, it was never going to work. Belated apologies for doubting it. And it is an extraordinary thing that all of us are here to appreciate what has happened. Thank you also to you and everyone at the Center for the Living City for doing so much to make sure that Jane Jacobs' work continues to be front and center in all of our consciousness. Like all great figures in our intellectual and cultural life, there is no shortage of commentary on Jane Jacobs and her work. And her 100th birthday this year is bringing still more, including, as Roberta just told you, this new film and two important new books, two biographies by Robert Canigal and Peter Lawrence that appeared this year. So what is there left to say? What is there that hasn't been said? Her ideas are, in many ways, universal, and they've changed our way of seeing the world. Her name has become shorthand for an entire set of urban values. Indeed, say, Jane Jacobs' urbanism, and a set of images will probably come to mind of a lively street mixed with residential and retail, filled with a diverse group of people engaging in what she famously called the sidewalk ballet, based, of course, on the world that surrounded her block on Hudson Street, the part of the West Village that was the inspiration for the wide-ranging and profound set of observations that formed the thesis of the death and life of great American cities. We all know this. As we all know, as Paul Kidder pointed out in an essay called The Right and the Good in Jane Jacobs' Urbanism, that Jacobs' writings, and I quote, along with Jacobs herself, have for many years functioned as a powerful moral beacon. Jacobs implicitly addressed issues of what right and good are in a broad moral and ethical way. These books present powerful arguments on the ethical underpinnings of what we call liberal democracy. And he went on to place her in the category of great protesters such as Thoreau and Martin Luther King Jr. I think this is correct. Although when we place Jane Jacobs in a broader category than the limited world of urbanologists, as of course we must, I prefer to group her with two other women who wrote extraordinary books around the same time as she wrote Death and Life, Rachel Carson and Betty Friedan. What joins together the death and life of great American cities, Silent Spring, and the feminine mystique, is that all three of them were written by women who were outsiders in their profession, who lacked the official credentials for criticizing an entire world of knowledge, whatever those credentials might be, and who were first dismissed as disruptors, who were just trying to get attention by making a loud and angry fuss. It would not last, a lot of critics said. Ignore them. They don't know what they're talking about. Well, we all know that the message of Silent Spring was quickly forgotten, right? It merely launched the environmental movement, which only continues to grow in strength more than half a century after Carson's book was first published, and has transformed contemporary science and culture and politics. And we all know also, whatever it was that Betty Friedan was trying to say had no lasting meaning either, right? After all, the role of women has not changed much since the 1960s, correct? While we cannot attribute everything that's happened to either goal, we know that both Carson and Friedan were pivotal, helping to give birth to broader movements, large portions of which found their voice through them. And so too, of course, with Jane Jacobs, the third in this astonishing triumvirate of great women who created world-changing books at almost exactly the same time. She may have been treated the worst of the three, because she was taking on a more established field that had more to protect. Environmentalism and feminism were in their infancy in the early 1960s, but city planning was not. It had an establishment, and that establishment did not think much of Jane Jacobs. And I think it's fair to say that no critic represented the establishment more than Louis Mumford, who wrote a stunningly vicious and arrogant review of Death and Life that, in the end, said more about him than it did about Jane Jacobs. It's worth talking about for a moment, since it says something not only about the view that serious, and I put that word in quotes, serious urban scholars had about Jacobs at the beginning of her career, it also tells you how much Jane Jacobs, like Rachel Carson and Betty Friedan, was up against. And it gives us insight into the fascinating relationship between Jacobs and Mumford, which was not a simple oppositional one, though you might think so at first. Mumford, like Jacobs, wrote from a position of moral authority. In fact, he could be far more presumptuous of moral authority than she ever was. Mumford could be sanctimonious in a way that Jane Jacobs never was. He had a fire and brimstone quality to him, and he was constantly urging us to follow him to avoid falling into urban doom. The key thing here is that the Mumford-Jacobs dichotomy, or Mumford-Jacobs dialectic, or whatever we want to call it, was not a simple matter of idealism versus pragmatism. Mumford, if anything, was the less pragmatic of the two, the more idealistic. He felt very strongly that there was a right way for cities to be, and his vision was an absolute one, resolute and pure. A misguided vision, I think, that most of us would probably now agree, but nevertheless resolute and pure in its sincerity and earnestness. It It was a vision shaped very much by the Garden City ideology of Patrick Geddes and Ebenezer Howard. Mumford so admired Geddes that he named his only son Geddes Mumford, and he never wavered from his belief that the city could be rigorously and thoroughly planned, and that it needed to be fully planned to save itself from physical and moral chaos. I think Mumford considered physical chaos and moral chaos to be more or less the same thing, which is a big part of the problem. He could not stand messiness, which is why he was particularly bothered by Jane Jacobs and her willingness to accept so many aspects of the urban condition as it was. To Mumford, this was the equivalent of a preacher looking the other way when a sin was being committed right before his very eyes. Now, it's hard to give Mumford his due when we're talking about him in the context of his relationship with Jane Jacobs, which I think shows him at his absolute worst. He was much better than his condescending and wrong-headed attitude toward Jacobs would suggest. His idealism and moral force made him one of the great public intellectuals of the 20th century. We should remember that he spoke out against the Vietnam War as vehemently as Jacobs did, and was an important early critic of American hegemony. As a pure architecture critic, writing about buildings rather than the broader question of cities, he could be brilliant, even dazzling in his insights. And maybe most important, we should remember that when he was not giving Jane Jacobs a hard time, he was probably the most important, articulate, and impactful critic of Robert Moses, other than Jane Jacobs herself. The triangle of Mumford, Moses, and Jacobs is actually a rather fascinating and strange one, because it so underscores how most things are not simple black and white issues, and that you can come to somewhat similar positions from entirely opposite directions. Anyway, I'll get back to this strange set of relationships. I'm inclined to call it an unloved triangle in a minute or two. For now, let me say something about that actual notorious review, which was published in the New Yorker on December 1st, 1962, and called Mother Jacobs' Home Remedies for Urban Cancer. The title, in some ways, tells us all we need to know. It's patronizing and sexist, and portrays Jane Jacobs as if she were an amateur faith healer, selling useless salves and hocus pocus to poor, innocent people, if they really understood anything, would know that they need a serious trained surgeon like Dr. Mumford to remove this dangerous tumor of urban decay. I reread the review the other day, and I was fascinated to discover, while the bottom line of it is pretty much what that title would lead you to expect, the route Mumford took to get there was actually circuitous and kind of interesting. The way he approaches the subject reminded you that his values are those of the humanist, which you would think would put him in somewhat of an awkward position going up against Jacobs. And it did make for some strange contortions. In the opening sections of the long review, remember this was in the days when nothing in the New Yorker was short, he did give Jane Jacobs a fair amount of credit in his patronizing and roundabout way for bringing to the profession's attention the human cost of urban renewal. Not for Mumford, the Robert Moses argument that to make an omelet you have to break a few eggs. Mumford would never descend to the callousness of that argument. On sound, hygienic terms, he said, the one way of meeting this demand within the limited areas provided was the erection of tall buildings whose grim walls are overshadowing ever larger sections of Manhattan. There is nothing wrong with these buildings except that, humanely speaking, they stink. Mumford then went on to remind the reader that he'd been criticizing public housing for years. And then, in a left-handed compliment, he finally gets around to Jacobs, referring her as the person who has stirringly presented the failings of public housing and observes, again with a whiff of condescension, that she first became known to planners when she spoke at a conference on urban design at Harvard, where, and I quote, she blew in like a fresh offshore breeze to present a picture dramatic but not distorted of the results of displacing large neighborhood populations to facilitate large-scale rebuilding. She pointed out a fact to which many planners and administrators have been indifferent, that a neighborhood is not just a collection of buildings, but a tissue of social relations and a cluster of warm personal sentiments associated with the familiar face of the doctor and the priest, the butcher and the baker, and the candlestick maker, and not the least with the idea of home. Sanitary, steam-heated apartments, she observed, are no substitute for warm-hearted neighbors, even if they live in verminous cold-water flats. All this is pure Mumford. Elegant prose, granting of a humanist perspective. He goes on to say, Mrs. Jacobs, she's always Mrs. Jacobs, Mrs. Jacobs' criticism established her as a person to be reckoned with. Here was a new kind of expert, very refreshing in current planning service, where minds unduly fascinated by computers confine themselves to asking only the kind of question that computers can answer and are completely negligent of the human contents and human results. At that point, we want to agree with Mumford. This able woman has used her eyes and even more admirably her heart to assay the human results of large-scale housing. And she was saying, in effect, that these top lofty barracks that now crowd the city's skyline and overshadow its streets are not fit for human habitation. All well and good so far, right? Mumford starts out craftily, getting us on his side by suggesting that he and Jacobs are the co-occupants of what we might call the humanistic and ethical caucus of public housing. But then he turns, and I quote again, "From a mind so big with a fresh point of view and pertinent ideas, one naturally expected a book of equally large dimensions. But whereas Sense and Sensibility could have been the title of her Harvard talk, what she sets forth in The Death and Life of Great American Cities comes closer to deserving the title of Pride and Prejudice. The shrewd critic of dehumanized housing is still evident, but the excellent clinical analyst has been joined by a character who is patched together out of the bits and pieces of her local personal observations nothing less than a universal theory about the life and death of great American cities." And then he goes on to accuse her of faulty data, inadequate evidence, and startling miscomprehensions of views contrary to her own. After that, Mumford has little positive to say. Let me stay with this just one moment longer, because this fascinating essay still has some remarkable observations, and every so often is right on point about some of Jacobs' shortcomings. In his way, almost in spite of himself, Louis Mumford helps us to understand Jane Jacobs better. For example, he calls her to account, correctly I think, for failing to appreciate projects such as Chatham Village in Pittsburgh, designed by Clarence Stein and still a model of socially conscious, earnest, and humane architecture. Her blind spot regarding some of Stein's projects and others that might be considered in some ways to be connected, however loosely, to the Garden City movement, reminds us that Jane Jacobs, for all her insight and ability to see things freshly, could have a few blinders of her own. She could be as guilty of the fallacy of physical determinism as anyone, which is to say that she could often exaggerate the importance of physical form and believe that physical form was absolute rather than relative in its influence on social patterns and on the success of a particular community. Neither she nor Mumford, for example, had much good to say about Stuyvesant Town, the huge post-war middle-income project built by the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company for white middle-class families. Not because of its lack of diversity, legitimate and even urgent failing of that project, but because its physical form in so many ways resembled that of the hated public housing towers. Neither Jacobs nor Mumford seemed able to see beyond that fact. Neither was comfortable admitting that though Stuyvesant Town, like many of public housing projects, was based on Le Corbusier's Tower in the Park model, the physical form did not, in fact, get in the way of a viable and stable and solid community. True, Stuyvesant Town rejects the model of the urban street that Jacobs has helped all of us appreciate. And true, it has more in common as a physical object with failed projects than with other successful ones. But it is not itself a failed project, and Jacobs couldn't bring herself to admit this any more than Mumford could. I might say parenthetically that it's a lot easier to appreciate Stuyvesant Town today, of course, when we have more than 6 decades of mature landscape growth than it was back when the complex was new and was austere and could, in fact, be a little bit chilly. Anyway, back to the review of Death and Life. So we have two people who share a hatred of bureaucracy and bureaucratic thinking and a deeply rooted belief that high-rise towers in open space are fundamentally inhuman. You'd think that would give them common ground. Yet they're totally opposite in what they do with this common perception. Mumford goes on to rip Death and Life apart, or at least to try and do that. His comments as the review goes on seem less and less convincing and more like those of a man who is desperately clinging to a set of ideas that are far more rigid and less connected to empirical observation than he realizes. He refers to her underlying thesis as emerging from the belief, and I quote, that the sidewalk, the street, and the neighborhood in all their higgledy, unplanned casualness are the very core of dynamic urban life. And the phrase, higgledy, casualness, like the title Mother Jacobs' Home Remedies, is absolutely dripping with disdain. To Mumford, who believes that the highest aspiration of man is the rational, logical solution of problems, few things are more distasteful than unplanned casualties, which he views not as a good example of recognizing empirical truth, but as an intellectual cop-out of the highest order. And that, in the end, is what Mumford concludes about Death and Life, and about Jane Jacobs herself, that she represents a kind of intellectual cop-out. He exaggerates the extent to which her theories are driven by the issue of crime prevention, taking note of her concept of eyes on the street, but thinking of it as shaping everything she has to say about the city, and accusing her of believing that everything about the form of cities should be determined solely by the search for safety from crime. Of course, eyes on the street is in fact only part of a more complex equation, and safety is hardly Jacobs' sole determinant. My sense is that Mumford views crime, like everything else, as a matter of rational planning. He's not unsympathetic to the issue, but he probably believes that if we gave everyone fresh, clean, sanitary apartments in a garden city and access to education, then they would have no reason to rob anyone else and all would be well. Keep in mind, again, that Mumford was not from the lock-em-up school. He was hardly a right-winger, hardly a law and order type. I think he knew full well how badly our society treats its underclass, and he knew that we needed to broaden their opportunities and give them education and a better quality of life. We cannot argue with him on that. But that hardly invalidates Jacobs' idea that a busy street, whatever it may look like, is a safer place than an empty street. Empty streets probably did not contradict Mumford's idea of a good urban environment. In his ideal world, he probably would have interpreted an empty street as meaning only that everyone was busy at the library, pursuing knowledge and self-improvement. Excessive crowding and activity, on the other hand, bothered him hugely. Mumford was, if nothing else, prim and stuffy to the core. It is the primness, I think, that is the most stunning thing to us today. At another point in the review, he takes off against Jacobs to say that, I quote, "Her simple formula does not suggest that her eyes have ever been offended by ugliness, or her ears offended by the roar of trucks smashing through a once quiet neighborhood. All that matters to Jacobs," he asserts, "is that density be high, there be no super blocks, and there be a mix of different activities." Then, Mumford says, all her social and aesthetic demands are satisfied. And he quotes her line, "A city cannot be a work of art," and follows it with the snide comment, "Citizens of Florence, Siena, and Venice, take note." But the issue was never so much aesthetics, which Jane Jacobs was never opposed to. Her objection was only to making them the exclusive determinant of urban design. It is really about order, and how much there can and should be a sense of pure order to the city. About how much the city could or should be patterned and diagrammed, and about how dense the city should be allowed to become. The ordered patterned city is also the city whose density is strictly controlled and limited. The fear of disorder is, as much as anything else, a fear of density and crowding run rampant. As the great Holly White reminded us often, the classic post-war view of the city as overcrowded, as an overcrowded mess that needed to be thinned out, emerged in large part from Mumford and his unrelenting advocacy of the Garden City. Mumford tells us in his review that as a native New Yorker, he has lived in every kind of housing in New York at one point or another, and, quote, "I am still unregenerate enough to prefer a quiet flat with a back garden on Hicks Street or row housing backing on a green common in Sunnyside Gardens to all the dingy liveliness of Clinton Street as it was back in the 20s. Take that, Jane Jacobs. Not for Mumford, the Lower East Side, which he viewed as a place to get out of, not as a place to learn from. Mrs. Jacobs' most original proposal then, as a theorist, Mumford tells us, is to turn the city's chronic system of disorder, excessive congestion, into a remedy. It's her belief that congestion and disorder are the normal, indeed the desirable conditions of life in cities. But it is now a well-established fact in biology that overcrowded quarters produce stress, even in animals, a state marked by anxiety and hostility. Not for nothing has Mumford done an entire series of articles in the New Yorker a few years earlier about overbuilding in New York, in which he complained that New York, and this is the early 1950s, remember, that New York was becoming increasingly unlivable and was so pressured and overcrowded and traffic clogged that to him it was, and he literally compared it to a concentration camp. Well, not the least of Jacobs' cultural influences on us has been to lead us to embrace and not reject density. And so much has changed in the 54 years since this review was published that Mumford's view on this part of the issue now seems hopelessly quaint, even anti-urban, totally indifferent to the generative energy that emerges out of both the density and the randomness of crowded urban situations. Mumford also takes Jacobs to task regarding her skepticism toward large urban parks. Here I will say, as in a couple of other parts of the review, he may have found a weak spot. Jacobs' bias toward the city street, toward the conventional, retail-filled block is so great that she did sometimes underestimate the value of great enterprises such as Central Park and Prospect Park, viewing them as examples of the kind of overarching mega projects that she generally found to be insufficiently connected to the fine grain of urban tissue. Mumford correctly says that we should hardly hold Frederick Law Olmsted responsible for the post-war era's inability to maintain the vision, not to say the physical condition, of its great parks. And I think it's fair, maybe, to give him that point. But let's get to the bottom line, which for Mumford is the contradiction he sees between Jacobs' admiration for what he calls the intimate values of neighborhood life and her unqualified adoration of metropolitan bigness and dynamism. A great city, in Mumford's view, is far more than an agglomeration of workable small parts. It needs something bigger, some overall metropolitan and even regional vision to grow and prosper. Now, one can't entirely argue with that, at least in principle, nor with the fact that Mumford, for all he detested Robert Moses, was always, like Moses, a big picture guy, seeking the overarching vision. It's just that his vision is not the same as Moses' vision. Mumford and Moses both wanted to rationalize the form of the city and the region, but they had very different ideas of density, of physical form, of social relationship, and of political process. But neither of them could see the city in the fine-grained way that Jane Jacobs did. Her fine-grained view of the city, her belief that it is not entirely rational or entirely plannable, that it has an organic life of its own that we need to respect, that the life of the street is one of the most important metrics of urban health that we have. All of this has now, of course, become common wisdom. Mumford's celebrated review represents a kind of last gasp of an older way of thinking. And while I disagree with much of it quite profoundly, as you can see, it did provide a useful counterpoint to what has become, in the last generation, a rather simplified notion of the Moses-Jacobs dialectic as explaining absolutely everything about how we can look at cities. We could sum up that dialectic as being one of centralized power, as represented by Moses, versus decentralized neighborhood and citizen-based power, as represented by Jane Jacobs. We know, of course, how much the pendulum has swung in our time from the Moses way of thinking to the Jacobs way of thinking, encouraged not only by the continued veneration of Jane Jacobs as a cultural figure, but also by the revisionist view of Moses put forth by Robert Caro in his celebrated biography, The Power Broker, of 1974. It is amazing to realize that Caro's book followed Death and Life by roughly a dozen years, and that it is itself now more than 40 years old. I don't disagree with the usefulness of the Moses-Jacob dialectic, or argue with the notion that it is fundamentally correct. But the duality it represents is highly limited, and maybe even a little cliched, and it turns the nuanced conversation we ought to be having about urbanism into a simple matter of black and white. I want to argue for bringing Lewis Mumford back into the equation, since when we think about the Jacobs-Mumford-Moses triangle, we have a much more realistic discussion, a more three-dimensional one, if you will, that I think can help our understanding of Jane Jacobs in the long run, because it raises her above the cliche of Moses big and bad, Jacobs small and good. If nothing else, incorporating Lewis Mumford into the Jane Jacobs discussion can force us to look at her more realistically. I think by now it should be pretty clear I'm not saying that to endorse Mumford's view of Jacobs, which, I will say one more time, is almost always condescending, sexist, and wrong. But let me go back to the three-way argument, rather than the dialectic, by using the example of the question of the automobile and its impact on the city. Here we find Mumford and Jacobs, intellectual opponents though they were, more in agreement than disagreement. I would say that they were not only the two most articulate critics of Robert Moses, they were among the most important advocates of limiting the impact of the automobile in the city. But he had no more interest than Jacobs did in seeing the city destroyed by the car. I think it's fair to say that he believed as much as she did that the automobile was the enemy of the city. Here, as with their attitude toward urban renewal policy, Jacobs and Mumford were, oddly enough, on the same side of the fence, though their styles and their sensibilities could not have been more different. All of this matters now, because we're today in some danger of viewing Jane Jacobs not as a creative and often surprising thinker, but is something of a cliche. And Mumford, whatever his other issues, helps us avoid this. Somewhat paradoxical, because Mumford's own view of Jacobs is not only patronizing and sexist, as I said, it's also more or less in line with the cliche of Jacobs as someone whose sole interest was in making everything in the world look like the West Village. The Mumford-Jacobs duality is no more helpful in terms of real insight than the Moses-Jacobs duality. Each reduces the other to cliche. I don't buy the notion that Jane Jacobs was nothing more than a walking advertisement for Greenwich Village. She knew better than to believe that a few cafes and some nice retail could solve all of our problems. And she was far more politically savvy. She was a radical and an outsider and a brilliant observer whose fundamental common sense led her to deep skepticism about the way in which cities were being developed. And she understood that cities had an organic nature to them and the power, like all living things, to regenerate under the right circumstances with the right guidance. The cliche of Jane Jacobs as the sweet lover of all things modest and friendly and neighborhoody, the cliche of Greenwich Village as the only neighborhood model, has two serious dangers. The first we see all the time. The Jacobs, having gone from being the radical outsider denounced by Mumford, representing the intellectual establishment, as well as by the political establishment of planning, has now become an accepted, even mainstream figure, with her ideas being oversimplified and all too often adopted by those who exploit them for their own profit and for very different ends. When I saw back in the early 2000s the proposed football stadium, remember that, for the west side of Manhattan, justified as having the potential to engage the street life of the area and enhance its neighborhood qualities, we all know that Jane Jacobs had gotten, you might say, a little too far into the mainstream. Same with the many new commercial retail projects bringing up around the country that call themselves villages or lifestyle centers, places that are kind of like malls but with little streets and no roof, so you get to walk outdoors from the Cheesecake Factory to J. Crew. By going along a sidewalk as you go past something called the Town Square, instead of walking through a covered mall. You've seen those, I'm sure, City Walk in West Palm Beach or Easton outside of Columbus, and there are many others. Developers proclaim these places to be real cities, as if they were a natural outgrowth of Jacobs' ideas. The term mixed use started as a sharp-eyed writer's observation of what underlies an organic urban fabric has become instead a developer's mantra. Now, it's true that these places are better than those, and they do represent a certain limited advance. But they're no more connected to the real city and its complicated organic ecosystem than the mall is. They're things apart, designed, built, and owned, and managed as corporate entities. And yet they often present themselves as being inspired by the ideas of Jane Jacobs. And in some ways, they sort of are. But they are also a reminder that the price of widespread success for any intellectual movement is that its ideas can be simplified, corrupted, co-opted, and vulgarized. There's another more subtle risk to the widespread acceptance of ideas that were radical back in the day when Mumford wrote about Jane Jacobs, which is that we allow them to become frozen in time. It's important to remember that the Greenwich Village that inspired Jacobs back in the 1950s no longer exists. It has been physically preserved, more or less, and we have her, among others, to thank for that, since in her role as a neighborhood activist, she helped prevent Robert Moses from making far more dramatic incursions into the village than he did. But if Jacobs' neighborhood looks essentially as it did back in her time, we then know that it is not really the same at all. In some ways, it has become too big and too gentrified to continue to function as Jane Jacobs wanted it to. In her day, a fairly natural process gave us the village she loved, and gave us the rest of that neighborhood, rich, pedestrian-oriented, exquisitely balanced city that New York once was. Jacobs' greatest contribution was in recognizing that planning was not able to do much except upset this natural equilibrium, and that discretion was the better part of city planning valor. Leave it alone, in other words, and don't screw up the natural evolution of things. Well, today, leaving it alone does not give us the city we want, the city that Jane Jacobs helped all of us to understand and admire. Today, the natural order of things yields something very different from the vibrant, highly diverse world she taught us to admire. The natural processes of growth now give us sprawl. They give us gigantism. They give us economic segregation. They often give us homogeneous, dreary design. And most important of all, they eviscerate the diversity that Jacobs taught us was so critical. To live in Jane Jacobs' West Village neighborhood now, you need to be an investment banker, which I'm pretty sure was not what she had in mind. I am not sure that her period of mid-20th century New York may not have been something of a historical anomaly in the way that diversity, human scale, and vitality seemed present as a matter of course. But that's another discussion for another day. For now, I think we can agree that these things no longer occur naturally, and that to keep them here, to assure that the city remains diverse, visually alive, physically appealing, and culturally vital, we need to do exactly the opposite of what she recommended. We need to intervene. We cannot stand aside and let nature take its course, as she wisely wanted it to do in the Greenwich Village she knew from the 1950s. In Jacobs' day, intervention into organic urban growth was symbolized by the destructive act of Robert Moses. Today, however, the forces that need to intervene are the forces set in motion by Jane Jacobs herself. To preserve her values, we have no choice but to think boldly, as both Mumford and Moses would have had us do. That's another reason that they have more to tell us today than we would think, however wrong they were. We can no longer trust that the city will take care of itself, as she urged us to do, or continue to believe that the greatest wisdom is in restraint, in standing back, and standing aside. That is the paradox, and it is also the challenge of keeping Jane Jacobs' vision alive in the 21st century, as we all must do. Thank you very much.
So how about you in the audience? Let's start with some questions and open discussion.
I'm going to get the mic.
The preservation movement, the inheritor of the ideas originally brought forth by Jane Jacobs, obviously. What we have seen now is not only the preservation of architectural landmarks and the introduction of historic neighborhoods, but we're also now beginning to see our government and many advocates, both preservationists and others, moving to make entire neighborhoods which have no architectural particular basis historic districts. Therefore, further development cannot take place, and buildings within that historic district which have no architectural echo to them become landmarks. And I'm wondering if you think that that's worthy of some comment on this today.
The question, for those who didn't hear the first part, was about historic districts and the fact that in many cases there are historic districts that do not have great architectural value. Two things. First, I think there's a legitimate argument to preserving history and neighborhoods that have historic importance for the city that may not be primarily architectural. So while architecture is the primary criteria for landmark designation, it is not the only one. Secondly, I think we all know, even though one is not supposed to say this, and it is not politically correct to say this, but I will say it anyway, that the landmarks law historically has often been used as a land use law, which is contrary to its original intention. And that's really what your question is. Are we not using it as a way of controlling density in some neighborhoods because our planners have not done it by more conventional means of zoning? It is, in effect, we might say that is this the right thing for the wrong reason? And does the end justify the means? That's a philosophical argument. In quite a number of cases, I have to say that I am willing to look the other way because I'm so glad that the neighborhood has been preserved, even if it was done under a stretched and extreme interpretation of the landmarks law. But I'm not running for office or running for landmarks chairman or anything else, so I can say things like that. I will concede that there have been at least some cases in which the purely architectural arguments have not been super compelling. Beyond that, I think it's really more important to talk about specific examples and so forth. There we are. I know that that's not a fully satisfying answer, but it's a problem that, frankly, particularly in the last generation, when prosperity has been so extreme for some in New York, and we've been building so much that I think we do need to use whatever tools we can to control density and overbuilding, even if they're not always the right ones. Now, by saying that does not mean, therefore, I agree with every designation or necessarily disagree with you that there have been some on somewhat flimsy basis and that, you know, may or may not ultimately have been the right decision.
Well, having been on both sides of this issue,
You're a landmark commissioner.
I was.
Right.
First, I would argue, and I think it's often said, that the preservation movement is the inheritor of Jane Jacobs' ideas. It is an aspect of her ideas. We have to understand that urbanism, preservation is only one aspect of it. For many years, I was a very strong critic of the Landmarks Commission in print. And then I was actually asked to become a commissioner under the Goldberger administration. And you'd be amused to know that when I discussed this idea with Jane, she said, no, you should never. That's going over to the dark side. And we argued about it, and I said, well, you know, Jane, I've done all this from the outside. Let me see if I can be useful from the inside. Every designation is research beyond belief. And I think you would be hard-pressed to uphold your estimation that there are districts being designated that don't deserve to be designated. I totally agree with what Paul's saying, that we have to use the tools we've got, and since the Planning Commission and the mayor and everybody else have totally abdicated in terms of, and so is the Landmarks Commission these days in many ways, we do have to use the tools we have. But the thing about the preservation movement which is so Jacobian, is that they're all fighters. They're neighborhood fighters. And they are standing up for values and things in their neighborhood that you might not even understand. But one of the things that I found very interesting being on the commission, we were fighting at one point, or never got to fight at one point, over the,
Columbus, Cunning Hartford Museum, Columbus Circle.
Columbus Circle.
Yeah.
We never got to fight.
Gallery of Art and Art.
Gallery.
Edward Rostow.
We never got to fight over it because the mayor and the developer across the street decided it didn't deserve even a hearing. But the point was, people would say, how could you designate that building if you, I said, first of all, I don't know whether I would, but it's not about whether I like the architecture of the building. It's not a personal view of how you see that community, or you see that building. There's a whole myriad of factors that go into consideration. It's not an issue of taste. So nowadays, there's a lot of argument because, especially from developers who are salivating to develop things out of scale in neighborhoods they never would have gone into if the preservationists hadn't made them of value. So we're in a very different argument today. And I think what you find, and there are plenty of neighborhoods that have been trying to be designated a la Jane Jacobs and have not succeeded. It's a very tricky time. And I think also in terms of what you were saying about the Greenwich Village and the neighborhood, all these things in Jane, I don't think Jane could have anticipated the impact of the global economy today. Greenwich Village, and she was here in, I think it was 02, 04, Mark, you correct me when the last book came out. She came and she spoke in the village and we went down. She really liked what she saw. Now, true, there are no shipbuilding people and no, none of the people aren't the same. Change happens. Change was what Jane talked about. Managing change was what she talked about. But everything today is a whole different argument because of the global economy, global money, and the investment bankers.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. I read a fascinating piece yesterday in some British publication I saw online that was reporting on a study in Hampstead, London, and the neighborhood of London, that talked about effectively, the problems of what I think we could call hyper-gentrification, and saying that in fact the insane increase in property values has actually been totally destructive of neighborhood fabric because all the local stores are going away. Because it's no longer a real neighborhood. It's a place in which, global capital is stashed. As Jonathan Miller, I think at one point, called the 57th Street buildings, these are safe deposit boxes in the sky. Right, and so, that you have, that actually hyper-gentrification can destroy all the neighborhood values that we see. So, there are great risks to prosperity as there are risks to, dangers to poverty. Let's, a couple more.
Yes, Lynn here. I wonder whether you could speak to.
Oh, can you wait a moment? That gentleman I think already had the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Hi. First of all, just thank you for the fantastic lecture. I haven't been a fan of yours for quite a while. I was wondering if either of you could speak to her last book that she wrote, where I think she was very observant of these larger macro trends that were happening and the real threats of inequality. And I'm wondering if you observed if even in that last book, if she had maybe gone back to some of her early views and either revised them or reinterpreted them to try to understand what was happening in the early 21st century.
Let me try that. First, it wasn't just the last book. In Death and Life, there's a whole chapter on the danger of success. So this was a theme of hers all the way through. I think it's hard. I mean, the Dark Age Ahead had a couple of very prescient things in it, and you go back and read any of her stuff, and it's kind of remarkable. It's hard not to be able to relate it to the present, but I think she always worried about success and the management of change. It's hard to place that in the context of today because this is so wildly different from anything that she really talked about.
Yeah, but I think she did sort of see the beginnings of much of what we're talking about now, if not quite the madness of global capital sloshing around the world as it does, or that high-rise real estate in New York and London and a few other cities would become the favored place in which to stash excess cash. I think she did see, not quite that, but she did see, as Roberta said, that, let me put it a different way. What I think she understood most of all, and she was very explicit about, is that the city is not a static thing. It is a dynamic, living thing, and nothing that is living stays in precisely the same state for very long. And that while I referred to at the end of my talk to the word equilibrium, which I think did sort of exist in the 50s and the time that she observed, but she knew, in fact, that it wasn't going to stay by itself indefinitely, and that, in fact, naturally, cities do grow and change, and they are not going to automatically grow in the right way. So I think she would have been comfortable with the notion that while an argument for non-intervention was exactly the right argument to make against Robert Moses in the 1950s and 60s, that hardly means that she was a believer in laissez-faire about cities at all. She was far too smart for that. Just as she was far too smart to believe that everything had to look like the West Village. It was more about observing and seeing and reaching empirical conclusions from understanding what you see in front of you, rather than a priori theorizing.
Also, the last thing, public thing that Jane did was write a letter to Mayor Bloomberg about the Greenpoint Williamsburg city plan. And needless to say, her advocacy was of the community's plan. In other words, the community had come up with a very detailed plan for change. It was not stopping change. It was planning differently. And she predicted exactly everything, all those towers, all the destruction of the fabric that's going on, is what she said the community's plan would not encourage. So it's a very interesting thing to go back to look at, because she was definitely advocating for change, the right kind of change, management.
I think this lady
Yes.
was next, so.
I wondered whether you could speak to, if you could speak to not just residential rent control, but also commercial rent control, and maybe how it never happened in New York and why.
Why? I have no idea why commercial rent control did not happen. And right, But that's a flippant answer and not a fair one. But I think politically it would have been impossible. I'm more concerned today about commercial issues in terms of retail and all that, but I feel there too, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we are dealing with economic forces that are far larger than anything that the city of New York can control on its own, even if it tried. The forces toward, centralization and chain things, the growth of, the CVS monster all over the world and equivalent things, and what that has done to neighborhoods is profoundly troubling, but it is simply our New York version of what has happened, to main streets in a town of 30,000 in the Midwest, too. Commercial rent control would not have stopped that force. There are things that can be done. I'm not ultimately sure that they're wise or useful, but it is profoundly troubling to see how few locally owned mom and pop businesses remain on so many commercial streets in so many neighborhoods in New York, and how they seem to be disappearing right and left everywhere. This is not a problem in the heart of Midtown or on 57th Street. This is a problem everywhere today, and I don't have an answer to it. I wish I did. And it's yet another reason to wish Jane Jacobs were here, because it would be interesting to see her comment on it. Because remember, Roberta, as you know better than anybody, Jane Jacobs was profoundly realistic. She was never into denial and fantasy. If something was there in front of you, she didn't pretend it wasn't there. And so, how she would have responded to the pressures on small, locally owned retail businesses, without which you cannot truly have the kind of streets we want and value, because they are the building blocks of that. I don't know what her response would have been. Maybe you do. Maybe you talk about it.
I would never dream to presume to know what she would say, but let me offer a few thoughts that I remember her having. She was profoundly market-based. She was not an advocate of, strong regulation, but she often said, just because it's happening today doesn't mean it will happen tomorrow. And she always called it planners for planning based on what's happening today. I walk around this city and it's very interesting. Two very interesting phenomena related to retail. A lot of all kind of stores are closing because people are shopping online, number one. And number two, who's now that are going to all those empty storefronts that are being closed by chains? Two different thoughts, and I know Jane would agree with me on this. We in this city are letting ourselves be suburbanized with malls. Time Warner, the new Calatrava so-called transportation hub is nothing but a mall with a train attached. Brookfield, everywhere, everything, and they're all getting tax breaks. The small businesses don't get tax breaks. So the deck is stacked for this to happen. These are not necessarily, the online shopping is obviously a natural phenomenon. But just remember, she said, just because it's today doesn't mean it will be tomorrow. let's see what is going to happen when things start turning around, and who are the tenants going to be in the empty stores. Let's take this side.
I live on the Upper West Side, and specifically between 87th and 96, which was a urban renewal pilot project in the 60s. I don't know how many people remember that.
I once lived there.
It was to be kept diverse, to have a mixed housing, and so was the commercial. At this point, we have no laundromats. They're all out of laundromats. Forget retail. We don't have laundromats. We don't have butchers. We don't have bakers, all of which were around in the 60s. Furthermore, 3 supermarkets in the area have died. We have no supermarkets left between 90th and I think it's 82nd. Well, I don't crack. But anyway, my question is, so this is killing the neighborhood, not having laundromats and basic services. And I have tried to go to the city council and say, where are the laws that provide these services, particularly in areas with brownstones that don't have laundromats in the buildings. So my question is, where are the activists? Where are the dangers? To support
On the Upper West Side, you have to ask where the activists are. I don't know where you are, but they're certainly there, and these are issues that come up all the time. These are kind of questions that, I mean, it's the same answer. It's the same answer. I mean, we're experiencing something on a global scale, and the city is not, there are things the city could do. The political will is not there. We know how to give all sorts of advantages to developers. We don't know how to give it to the things that everyday people need. Simple as that.
Wonder, the developers today seem to have assumed the power of Robert Moses. I was told by a very high government official, Ellie, don't try to get the zoning laws changed. The real estate interests are too powerful. So what I'm asking you is, what do you think we can do? I've gone to every community board saying how these buildings don't come down like pictures as exhibit. After 3 weeks, they're up for a lifetime. And as far as landmarking, I rode to Washington with Jackie Kennedy to save Grand Central. Now there's going to be a 67-story building at Vanderbilt and 42nd Street. And you're going to need to have a periscope to find Grand Central. But again, it's the real estate people, it's the developers who have so much power over the legislators that nothing seems to be able to get changed. At Sutton Place, I happen to live on way east on 57th Street, but I think the two of them, Mumford and J.D. Jacobs, would turn over in their graves if they saw what was happening today. What do you think we can do about changing those zoning laws? The sale of air rights would kill them.
Well, it's the same, also the same question, in a different guise. Yes, they probably would be turning over in their graves at
Jane
this
would
point.
be out there.
And they would be, right, exactly. I think in terms of the plague of the super tolls, the market which created these things is also going to put an end to them because it's drying up rapidly. And I'm awfully glad, not only do I not want to live there, I'm awfully glad it's not my money investing in those buildings, because some of them are going to lose a lot of money for some people. I mean, because that market was never nearly as big as a lot of people thought, and so forth.
And they can no longer hide behind the shelf or brand. They
Right. And the laws have actually, this is a very, very, very positive change that you cannot use it for money laundering by creating a fake LLC and buying apartments in its name. And that, I think, for that we have both activists and journalists this time to thank, because some investigative journalism has actually made a difference there. We have, right now, I hope I don't get into trouble saying this, contrary to the expectations of many activists in this city whose politics are sort of left of center and believe in neighborhood preservation, we do not have a city administration that is particularly supportive of that process. It is supportive of the ideas of affordable housing and the ideas of inclusivity, but the mayor's view is that the way to get these things is not to say no to development, but to say yes to development and then just extract a price in return from developers. So, developers now must either build affordable housing or help provide for it in some other way. They can't just do this stuff for but nevertheless, for all of the current administration's advocacy on issues like this, it is as freewheeling as the previous administration encouraged development. They just have a different philosophy. They just feel, okay, we will not say no. We will just hold it ransom and ransom back from these projects something to help the city. I can understand the pragmatic instinct behind that. Ultimately, however, it doesn't take you to a very good place, and that attitude alone does lead to sort of unchecked development. And the fact that a developer may be paying a certain ransom that goes into an affordable housing fund is better than if that did not take place, but nevertheless, it does not address the issues that are, I think, of most concern to most of us in this room, at least not adequately. And I'm very worried about that, frankly. Again, not because I don't believe in development or growth and change, and I really do not believe that a living city can be a frozen city, but there is a point at which it does begin to not make sense. Here too, by the way, for all his impossible, sanctimonious pain in the assness, Mumford may be useful to look back at too, because he was such an articulate critic of excessive scale and of indifference to some of these issues.
I just want to add, I think any of you who are activists, don't stop being activists. I want to give you a sort of a quote. I wrote it down in the darkness of the theater that Jane said, so I'm not exactly sure it was right, but you'll get the thought. She said, it's very wicked to be a victim of predators, but it's even more wicked to allow yourself to be a victim. And what she was saying was, citizens have to keep doing what they're doing. I want to make a suggestion, because part of what I feel the problem is that some of the advocacy organizations have failed us. And you all should be telling them. Why should Municipal Art Society be calling for a moratorium on 90-story buildings? Tell them, write them, call them. And there's a new organization. Is Lynn Ellsworth?
Yeah, I'm here.
What's the name? View and Scale City? What? Oh, New York is for a View and Scale City. How's that for a shout out? They're really out there trying to fight these issues. So your instincts are right, your assessment is right. Real estate is owning the city beyond even their wildest dreams. Well, it is, there are levels of who is in charge, but they're all together on the same issue. So, at any rate, don't give up. Yeah, let's take one more. Can we go get a mic over there?
Thank you. Honored to be here. Appreciate having the last question. So I'm a writer. I write about architecture, and I have learned far too much this year about climate change. It's not a great thing to know so much about, but certainly, I mean, I'm in my 40s. I would really feel privileged to spend the rest of my life in New York City, but I know that it will be a dramatically different place, and I just love to hear your thoughts, Paul, on living with so much more water.
Sure. Are you investing in waterfront property on 6th Avenue? Or,
Washington Heights.
in Washington Heights, yeah, exactly. We cannot not take climate change into effect. I mean, I am hoping for this among many reasons that we do not end up with a climate change denier in the White House. You know, and I think in New York we have at least begun to acknowledge this. I think certainly the Goldberger administration, even if some of us may differ with some of its policies about development, could not be accused of indifference to the issue of climate change, and you know, has been pretty strong about rethinking what we build along the coast and acknowledging it and operating accordingly. I mean, I do not. I think we are in a much better position, say, than Miami Beach, which is a joke at this point, and is really in a much graver situation. We are not denying, we are planning. We probably need to be planning more. And so, but because, you know, the rise in, you know, I was blown away by one thing that was said to me when I toured the Four Freedoms Park on Roosevelt Island, Louis Kahn's last design, which is, I think, one of the great things to have happened in New York in the last generation. It's something I never, like this beautifully restored building, I never thought I would be lucky enough to live to see it happen, and here we all are. I was told that the only significant change that had to be made from Kahn's design was that all the stuff along the water, the riprap along the water, had to be re-engineered because the water level had risen so much since he designed it in 1973 and 4. And everything else was built exactly as he planned it, but higher with different engineering because so much had happened just in these years since then. That was a very sobering thing and a reminder that in fact the forces that we need to contend with in fact didn't begin when everybody started talking about the words climate change. It's been gradual for some time, and I think we are not doing enough. I sometimes comfort myself in saying that, you know, New York is more aware and more realistic than most coastal cities, which we are. But are we realistic enough? I truly don't know. And should we be looking not only at different kinds of provisions right along the water's edge, but at things as dramatic as, you know, structures in the harbor that I am not an engineer and do not want to pretend to be, but I think we should be listening to engineers and hearing what they have to say, and that should be part of the dialogue. And we certainly should be open to things as radical as that if ultimately a convincing case is made.
I just want to thank you all for coming and thank Paul for an extraordinary evening.